There were always problems. For everyone. But most of them always started with big money. Seo Yujin was just an ordinary girl, but with an unusual fate. If it weren't for that cursed debt, she would have simply remained poor and ordinary. None of this would have ever happened to her. And she would have never crossed paths with such a dangerous beast. But if it was written in her fate, there was no way to escape it. All she could do was accept things as they were. When Seo Yujin met him, she didn't fully understand the situation at first. But deep down, she knew she could handle it, even if sometimes she was scared. Whispers spread across the office. Mr. Jin Tao was coming back home. As always, the sharp sound of the CEO's expensive heels echoed through the hall as she rushed to her office, greeting employees along the way. Whenever employees saw the CEO, they'd straighten up and greet her politely, making sure she noticed them at their desks. Yujin overheard the news about CEO's younger brother return, and it made her uneasy. Once the CEO's office door closed, everyone finally breathed easier. Some employees started asking who Jin Tao was and why the CEO seemed so furious. Rumor had it that the CEO's younger brother was coming home, and that's why she was so angry. People said every family had that one difficult child. Some even whispered they might not be real siblings. Jin Seo was the CEO of the company, but describing Jin Tao with just the word complicated was an understatement. While Seo was away, Executive Director Yoon wanted to meet her. The CEO wondered what he wanted. Maybe he had problems of his own. But she was already furious and distracted by her brother's return. And honestly, that return was a big problem. After all, he didn't exactly run away from home, lose his mind over women, or become some kind of social outcast. On the surface, he seemed normal, just as expected. But the truth was, Jin Tao was a cruel bastard. Even though he hid behind many masks, his true nature always slipped through. And it wasn't a kind one. She remembered him as a quiet, normal child. Even when other kids teased him, he didn't seem to care. Tao was 10 years old when he finally realized something was wrong. That's when everything began to change. A group of bullies approached him after school. He looked like a kid from a rich family, easy prey. The boy panicked and bit the one who scared him the most, desperately trying to protect himself. That single bite was the first step toward the person he would become. Tao bit so hard the skin tore, and that moment became his trigger, the beginning of serious psychological problems. Violence often starts this way. Maybe it's a survival instinct, but after that day, no one could stop him. One day, his father left Tao outside the house as punishment, refusing to let him in until he admitted what he'd done wrong. It was one of the coldest days ever recorded. In the end, a battle of pride ended with Tao collapsing after 5 hours and 17 minutes. If they had been even a little later, he might have lost his arms and legs to frostbite. One autumn day, before graduating college, Tao decided to enlist in the army. Leaving only a few words behind, he volunteered to become an officer. The whole family was shocked, but their reaction wasn't the right one. He joined the military without asking anyone's opinion. And honestly, his family tried to fix him afterward. But the truth is, he was just born a monster. 3 years later, Tao returned to Korea after serving in a conflict zone most people never even got close to. Seo was sure that Director Yoon couldn't just leave without a scandal, and asked who made sure he left quietly. Manager Kim replied that Secretary Seo Yujin had brought him coffee. And shortly after that, he left. The CEO knew very well that secretaries had ways to handle things like this. Jin Seo asked Secretary Yujin to come to her office. Meanwhile, she wondered if maybe it was worth keeping an eye on him. We're talking about 50 million. Nobody could quite believe it. It was a huge amount. Of course, it was just the first investment, not a salary. And what about 10 million won a month? Was that really too little? Her younger brother was supposed to finish his military service in 5 years. But only 3 years had passed. And now he was coming back. The CEO thought he might need some help. It seemed simple enough. Follow his schedule and escort him when needed. Most importantly, she'd need daily reports. 3 months max. The CEO planned to transfer her to the planning department afterward, a job Yujin had always dreamed of. But Seo Yujin didn't understand. If this was so simple, why her? The CEO wanted her to keep an eye on her brother, to make sure he didn't cause trouble. She believed Yujin could handle it perfectly. Yujin was stunned. What could she possibly do about the CEO's brother's problems? If something happened, she wasn't supposed to fix it. Just keep him away from the press. If he appeared on social media, the company's stock would plummet, and the family would become the center of every scandal. Jin Seo didn't see it as too much to ask. Seo Yujin really shouldn't have been that surprised. The conditions were unusual. What kind of man needed this much supervision? Yujin thought there had to be people way more qualified for a job like this. The CEO tried to explain delicately. She knew her brother wasn't the type to beat women or children. At least, not yet. Maybe this was how they'd come to this day. That money. It felt more like shame than payment. She had to meet him, but Yujin didn't even know what he looked like. The CEO assured her she'd recognize him instantly. You'll know him when you see him. But the girl wasn't so sure she trusted such a vague statement. Things could go wrong. She tried to find the manager's number, but it wasn't working. The noise around her made it hard to focus. Because of her father's debt, she'd never had a full-time job. But she'd gained one useful skill that always helped her. Her biggest weapon was simple. She always told the truth. Even when people didn't like her for it, she believed it was the right thing to do. The moment of truth had finally come, and her instincts were screaming louder than ever. A cold wave of fear washed over her. She didn't have to wait long. The first thing that caught her eye was a guy. Handsome, but with a heavy, almost suffocating aura around him. He walked right up to her and called her by name. She instantly knew she shouldn't get involved with this man standing before her. But she forced a smile and replied that yes, he wasn't mistaken. It really was her. She greeted him politely, already knowing from the start that his name was Jin Tao, and said it was nice to meet him. The secretary added that the car was waiting in the parking lot and offered to show him the way. But Tao wasn't even listening. He brushed past her, clearly intending to leave. Seo Yujin tried to stop him, asking him to follow her. Inwardly, she was sure of one thing. This man was strange. There was something dangerous about him. She asked if he'd chosen a place to stay, wondering where they should head. Tao muttered something about going to the Central Hotel. She got the message. The rest of the ride was silent. She had no idea what to talk about with him. Tao was the one to break the silence, asking if she'd been sent by his sister. The one who always had to keep everything under control. Yujin didn't even know what to say. She wasn't sure if she should answer at all. Jin Seo hadn't given her any clear instructions. All the CEO had said was that her younger brother was coming home after a long absence and felt uncomfortable, especially after serving in the military for so long. He probably assumed she was just some assistant assigned to take care of all his errands. But then he shot her a suspicious look and asked if she'd heard that he doesn't hit women or kids. It was so until 3 years ago. Encounters with women hiding guns under their skirts and children carrying bombs and fruit baskets had changed the way he saw the world. Nothing in this world came for free. But Yujin had been blinded by money. Tao asked for her opinion, giving her that same unsettling look again. It felt terrifying. Like her life was in his hands, and he was deciding what to do with it. The look in his eyes was that of a wild predator, deciding whether to kill or not. And so, the next 3 months would reveal everything. Whether this beast could be tamed, or whether she could survive beside him. Seo Yujin and Tao had already arrived at the Central Hotel, the place he'd chosen to stay. As they entered the main lobby, they saw a man rushing forward to greet Jin Tao with obvious joy. Even though it had been years since they'd last seen each other, the man recognized him instantly, but still asked to make sure. Was it really him? The young master who'd served in the military? Kim Il-deok, the hotel's manager, came closer, asking when Tao had returned and complaining that no one had told him. He would have given him a proper welcome. Tao was just as surprised that manager Kim was still working at the hotel after all this time. Yujin was quietly amazed by their easy conversation. The manager smiled, admitting he'd already reached retirement age last year. But he was genuinely happy to still be working. Even my mother wouldn't forgive me if I pretended not to recognize you because of old age. The manager joked lightly. Then he asked how long Tao planned to stay this time, unaware that he had already been discharged from the military. When he found out, the manager was genuinely happy to hear that Tao was finally returning to normal civilian life. The guy asked manager Kim to prepare a room for him, saying he'd be staying there for a while. The manager promised to arrange everything and offered him his usual suite. While Yujin watched their conversation, trying to keep up with what was happening, something unexpected suddenly caught her attention again. A loud, arrogant man was making a huge scene at the front desk because the receptionist didn't know who he was and, in his opinion, wasn't treating him properly. He shouted that he'd invested a fortune into this hotel and demanded to know how she dared speak to him like that. He didn't want to hear any excuses, just yelled for the manager to be called immediately. The manager quickly appeared at the reception desk, clearly intent on diffusing the situation fast. Yujin wasn't even surprised. The world was full of liars. She silently wished the manager good luck. The manager politely asked the man how he could help. The man snapped back with loaded questions. Was he really the manager? Did he even know who he was talking to? Then barked an order to prepare the most expensive suite on the top floor. Kim Il-deok apologized politely, but explained that the suite was already booked. He offered him a luxury room on the first floor instead. The man thought the manager was either mocking him or too old to hear properly. He repeated again that he wanted the top floor and the best room. To Yujin, it all looked like a one-man circus. But deep down, she felt like she'd seen this face somewhere before. The manager remained calm and patient. He said they'd arrange another excellent room for him and offer their best wine as an apology. The man got even angrier, grabbed the manager by the collar, and shouted that he wasn't some beggar who needed free wine. All he wanted was the top floor suite. Yujin could hardly listen to this nonsense any longer, but she didn't know how to stop it. And watching Tao, she could tell he was about to snap. When she finally raised her voice, the man froze, but didn't even bother to look at her. His gaze was like that of a wild beast who'd smelled blood and wasn't about to back down from the hunt. But Yujin remembered the CEO's warning clearly. Her brother must never end up in the press. She realized the situation was critical. Too dangerous. But she had to do her job, keep Tao out of trouble. She needed to stop this. "Why are you ignoring me? Can't you even do your job?" the man snapped, still furious. Then he noticed someone challenging him from the sidelines, and got even more irritated. His eyes landed on Tao, who stood calm but stared at him with a deadly serious look. The man couldn't back down now. If he did, he'd look like a fool. He had to get what he wanted from the manager. Yujin quietly took out her phone, hit record, and gave the man a polite smile. She asked sweetly if she could ask him a few questions. Tao was surprised by her move, but didn't stop her. He was curious to see how this would play out. The man, already furious, snapped, "Who the hell are you?" Yujin didn't flinch and calmly asked, "Aren't you Director Lee Jung-jin from Hank Corporation?" The man confirmed her guess. Yes, he was the director, but had no idea what she wanted from him. The girl calmly warned him she was recording their conversation, then introduced herself as reporter Kim Ji-young from the Everyday News. What a lucky coincidence to meet him at this very hotel. Not too long ago, the second generation of conglomerates had been on trial after a drug scandal. The article about it had been weak, but who would have thought that today she'd get the chance to interview him in person? The man grew noticeably nervous and angry, demanding that she move the phone away from him. But she told him to just ignore it. They could keep talking as if the phone wasn't even there. Just think about it. He was still on probation. Yujin continued her conversation with the unpredictable man. The woman standing nearby couldn't take it anymore. She'd had enough and walked away. The man decided to follow her, still yelling that everyone had made a huge mistake today. He'd spent a fortune on this hotel and hoped the devil would take them all. The manager and the receptionist finally let out a breath of relief. Yujin couldn't believe she'd actually managed to calm that crazy man down. At last, she could exhale. She'd been worried her plan was too simple and never expected it to work so fast. Tao shot her a sharp look and told her never to interfere in situations like that without his permission. He hated when anyone got in his way. Yujin didn't care. She was going to do it anyway. It was her job, and she was paid well for it. He didn't care what kind of job she had, but warned her not to annoy him again. Otherwise, there would be serious consequences. She already guessed what those consequences could be. But even so, she couldn't allow herself to neglect her duties. The manager apologized for interrupting their conversation, but politely offered to escort them upstairs. Tao didn't say a word. He just turned around and followed the manager. Yujin stood there, unsure what to do next. Her heart was pounding like crazy. She'd never been this exhausted in her life. It was already late at night when Yujin finally got home. All she wanted was to rest. Without even changing, she collapsed face first onto her bed and didn't move an inch. She couldn't understand why this day felt so long. Tao was already getting on her nerves to the point where she wanted to punch him. But one thought kept her calm. Her bed was so soft, and she'd missed it all day. But the same old problem was still there. Money. It was hard, but she had to push through for her own future. Just 3 months of babysitting the son of a third-generation chaebol, and she'd earn 100 million won. It wasn't an easy job, but how could she turn down such an offer? 3 months wasn't that long. She just needed to prepare herself to ignore her client's unpredictable behavior. Seo Yujin was born into a loving family, but they were never well off. She'd always dreamed of having enough money to buy anything she wanted. No matter how much she worked, her father's debt was massive, and everything she earned went toward paying it off. Her mother spent days and nights washing dishes at restaurants, but the pay was so small they barely got by. Yujin had to juggle school and part-time jobs with no time to rest. They'd gone through a lot together, but the debt never got smaller. 3 months of this job would let her pay off 10% of her father's debt. She couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. Earning that much money honestly was impossible. When the CEO offered Yujin this job, she accepted without a second thought, even knowing how difficult it would be for her. She didn't even realize how fast she fell asleep. It felt like she'd just closed her eyes, and it was already time to go to work again. Greeting everyone with a warm "good morning," Secretary Seo started her new workday. Jin Seo asked how her brother Tao behaved the night before, but Yujin said nothing special happened. The CEO then asked if she planned to check Tao's room to make sure everything was okay. But there were already rumors that last night he'd caused trouble in the hotel lobby. Seoryangar was probably talking about the argument that broke out when Yujin stepped in to help the manager get rid of an unruly guest. Yujin stood in front of the door, breathing heavily. She had never been this nervous before. Her entire paycheck depended on this guy. 3 months, she thought bitterly, still waiting for Tao to open the door. What a great joke. And this was just her first day on the job. Tao had made a scene in the hotel lobby last night. He probably went down to drink to adjust to the time difference. She assumed he'd gotten into a fight with a drunk guest. The man had started it. There were plenty of witnesses, and they'd managed to cover everything up. 12 weeks until the end of this assignment. But why wasn't he opening the door? She didn't get it. Anyway, Tao's suite had plenty of rooms. The CEO's words kept echoing in her head. If she agreed to monitor him 24/7, she'd get an extra 10 million won each month. Yujin had always learned to adapt and obey her superiors. She knew exactly whose pocket her salary came from. She had to do whatever it took this time too. But she also needed to let off steam. She felt like screaming for Tao to open the damn door already. He'd been doing whatever he wanted while she wasn't around. Now she had to keep an eye on him 24/7. She shouted through the door, telling him to stop pretending he wasn't inside. She didn't even notice the hotel staff member approaching her, who informed her that the guest from this room had gone to the gym and was now in the cafe on the 2nd floor. That explained why no one answered. The staff member asked her to keep quiet so as not to disturb other guests. Yujin hurried to the cafe, where Tao was supposed to be after his workout. She spotted him sitting by the window, sipping his coffee. Across from him sat manager Kim, who told Tao he'd prepared everything he'd asked for, and to let him know if he needed anything else. When the manager saw Yujin, he said he had to go. On his way out, he greeted her and she smiled back. Yujin walked up to Tao's table and sat down across from him. She wished him a good morning and said she was glad to see him safe and sound. Did he really enjoy making people chase him around while he calmly sipped his coffee alone? Yujin finally asked him to at least inform her if he planned to go somewhere. She'd been waiting outside his room for ages. Tao didn't think he owed her any explanations. If she was supposed to watch him, then she'd better be by his side all the time. In his eyes, they weren't close enough for him to share his plans with her. Even though the girl was furious, she tried to smile and keep the conversation going. She mentioned that she'd heard he had a little incident last night. Tao didn't consider it an incident, just a minor misunderstanding. And he had no intention of talking about it, especially not with Yujin. Because of what happened, she'd now have to stay by his side 24/7. That was Jin Soryang's order, and she was sure he wouldn't argue with that. Thanks to him, Yujin was staying overnight in a hotel room for the very first time. But Tao wanted to remind her of something, whether she remembered what he told her last night. Tao couldn't stand anyone meddling in his business, and if she still wanted to be around him 24/7, she'd have to stay invisible. Tao knew very well that Yujin desperately needed the money, so she'd better do her job without bothering anyone. Yujin tried to explain that if it weren't for the money, she wouldn't be here at all. But for her, it wasn't easy to live without causing trouble. That whole incident happened when she wasn't around. She didn't like it either, and he should keep that in mind. She couldn't imagine who in their right mind would willingly clean up someone else's mess. The CEO Jin kept saying it wasn't mandatory, but she knew very well that Yujin wouldn't refuse that kind of money. How could an ordinary office employee like her not obey an order from the company's CEO? She wasn't thrilled about the situation either, and Tao needed to understand that. The man was surprised to hear she was getting paid for this. He hadn't expected his sister to go that far, spending so much out of her own pocket. Yujin couldn't understand why he thought she'd just follow him around for free without any reward. Her services were paid for, at least as long as she didn't mess up. But with his behavior, that could happen any minute, and then she'd be in big trouble. Despite everything, she was starting to think the amount the CEO offered her was way too small. It wouldn't hurt to ask for hazard pay on top of it. Tao suddenly wanted Yujin to prove to him why he even needed her services, and why he couldn't do without her. She was genuinely stunned. His demand was ridiculous, and she wasn't planning to prove anything to him. He wanted her to give him a reason why he should keep her around, waiting for her to prove her usefulness. Even though Yujin knew this was nonsense, she still had to agree. Tao made it clear he wasn't generous enough to keep useless people close to him. She had expected this, but still couldn't wrap her head around why her life had to be this hard and complicated. When she entered Tao's room, she was shocked. It was huge and stunning. She couldn't help but ask how much he paid per night for such a luxurious room. He didn't understand why she cared. She'd never be able to afford a suite like his anyway. Yujin figured she might as well say something nice. Surprisingly, in black, he looked like a Grim Reaper. Tao didn't get her compliment or why she made that comparison. Yujin hurried to explain that she hadn't meant anything bad. He suggested she just blame it on nerves and forget what she'd said. Then he tried to leave again, making her wonder where he was going. He said he wanted to visit one square shopping mall. After being away for so long, that's where he wanted to go first. Tao and malls did not really match, but since it was a work day, the parking lot was nearly empty. He didn't want to explain anything in detail, just said he needed to get to the 4th floor. But there were plenty of spots on the 2nd floor too. If he kept making things this complicated, life in Korea would be pretty hard for him. Tao didn't like repeating himself. He added that it had to be Zone C and told her to confirm whether she understood or needed him to repeat it. Yujin did exactly as Tao told her. At first, everything seemed fine, not even a hint of him being annoyed. But he walked so fast that Yujin couldn't keep up. She kept calling out for him to wait. She apologized, but he was 188 centimeters and she was only 165 centimeters. With that kind of height difference, their walking speed was nowhere near the same. Since they'd be together everywhere, she asked him to at least slow down a little. Tao didn't care whether she kept up or not. If she couldn't, that was her problem. All she had to do was push the button and quietly follow him. Was he a germaphobe or something? Afraid of catching something by touching buttons himself? Maybe this was part of his ridiculous usefulness test, making her silently press elevator buttons. She asked out of pure curiosity. After all, he could have pressed the button himself. It's not like he had broken fingers. His training at IDT was brutal. Weeks without sleep, endless intense drills. Yujin noticed how suddenly serious his expression had become, unlike anything she'd seen before. Tao told her how they trained in swamps and swam in seawater. They often didn't even get the chance to shower or wash their clothes. That was quite a long answer, but at least it confirmed he wasn't a germaphobe. She wanted him to wait because she didn't understand why he was testing her or trying to prove she was useless to him. He told her to prove why he needed her services. But honestly, she had no idea how to do that. Aside from driving or pressing elevator buttons, he couldn't imagine what else she could possibly do for him. She might think he was a jerk, but one day he'd regret it. The day she'd make him kneel. He sped up again, and Yujin struggled to keep up. It made her even angrier. As they walked down the hallway, Tao noticed a security camera pointed straight at him. He even wondered where Yujin had gone, so the camera would record them together. Tao walked fast, and Yujin barely kept up, practically running through the crowd to avoid losing him. When she finally almost caught up, she tried to ask where he was going, but he didn't answer. She grew more and more irritated. Seriously, how hard was it to answer a simple question? Or was he just ignoring her on purpose, testing her patience? She noticed he kept looking around, but she couldn't figure out what exactly he was searching for. Yujin had no choice but to follow him. Maybe things would become clearer a little later. When the man suddenly stopped and glanced around again, Yujin asked what he was looking for and offered to help. He kept shifting his gaze. Ceiling, walls, then ceiling again. What exactly was he trying to find? And could he at least tell her? Earlier, he'd said she could prove she was useful. Yujin felt confident she could help. After all, she once managed to find a lost cat. Tao finally turned to her, but the way he looked at her made her uncomfortable. He asked her to imagine being a 20-year-old girl. Yujin almost laughed. She actually was around that age. She'd turn 30 next year, but technically, she was still in her 20s. Tao stayed silent for a couple of minutes, then stated firmly that Yujin had been at this mall on Saturday. She'd parked her car in the underground parking lot, 4th floor, Zone C. Then she got into this elevator and calmly went up to the 1st floor. As usual, she looked composed and focused on her own business. After that, she disappeared into thin air. Her car sat in the parking lot for almost a week. During that time, she never showed up on either the 1st or the 4th floor. Yujin asked what she'd been wearing that day when she first appeared at the mall. The girl understood there had never been anything between Tao and that girl, but she couldn't figure out what exactly he was trying to prove. He stood there silently, as if piecing together a logical chain of thoughts to lead him to the right conclusion. He needed to calm down and think. Most likely, the girl had planned to meet someone at the mall and had been in a hurry. The meeting spot was probably the restaurant area on the 6th floor. It was always quieter there, perfect for private conversations. But why did she get off on the 1st floor instead of going up to the 6th? Did she change her mind? No. It was much simpler. She had just arrived early. She probably wandered around the mall first, slowly making her way up the escalators to the 6th floor. For most girls, that was normal behavior. Surrounded by dozens of boutiques, they usually couldn't resist buying something. The reason Yujin asked about her outfit was simple. She believed that girl was meeting up with a man. Dinner and a movie. The classic date combo. And the mall even had rooftop parking. If the guy was also driving and they left in his car, it made perfect sense why she never came back to the underground lot. Yujin herself wouldn't have done that. Parking there was way too expensive. Tao pointed out that if there'd been something on the 1st floor she'd wanted to see, Yujin's guess might actually make sense. It annoyed him to see Yujin trailing after him like a clueless goldfish, doing whatever nonsense he demanded. Though deep down, he figured she might still be useful. Yujin didn't like being called a clueless goldfish. He didn't know who she really was, and that ticked her off. While talking to Tao, Yujin noticed other women glancing his way. Clearly, they found him handsome. She silently agreed he was attractive. But after spending just a little time with him, she realized his complicated personality made him nearly impossible to deal with. His difficult character and rude manners completely erased whatever charm his looks gave him. Appearances can be deceiving. Those strangers who admired his face had no clue about the jerk hiding beneath it. Lost in thought, Yujin didn't even notice when Tao suddenly walked off again, without saying a word. She had to run to catch up. There were lots of blind spots in the surveillance system. That's why they couldn't get a perfect picture of what happened. Tao didn't expect to find many witnesses either. Payments were electronic now, and weekends were crowded. People rarely remembered details. While they were standing in the parking lot, thinking through the girl's actions, they didn't even notice a car speeding toward them. Yujin panicked. For some reason, she froze and couldn't move. The car whooshed past at high speed, the wind forcefully pushing her to the side. The driver raced out of the parking lot without even slowing down at the turns. Yujin was furious. She couldn't believe idiots like that were allowed to drive cars. But then she looked at Tao and was stunned. Someone had almost died right next to him, and he didn't even flinch. Tao ignored her again, still thinking about the situation with that girl. He decided to check the exit, while Yujin was supposed to head to the car. They'd meet at the main gate. She was pissed. She wasn't his servant, and she didn't have to follow his every order. She grumbled to herself. 8,001 for 40 minutes? That wasn't parking. That was daylight robbery. Could she at least expense it? As she drove out of the parking lot, Yujin spotted the car that had sped past her earlier. Could it really be the same jerk from the rooftop? She hated people like him. He didn't care about anyone else, or what people thought of him. Oddly enough, the man was calm and collected, even though just a few minutes ago he'd almost hit someone. Then she noticed Tao waiting for her near the parking gate, standing not far from that jerk. The man, without even looking around, flicked his cigarette butt and missed his target. Yujin froze. She knew exactly what kind of temper Tao had, and he definitely wouldn't like this. The cigarette butt floated toward him slowly, and Yujin prayed it wouldn't actually hit Tao. It nearly did. If it had, things could have ended very badly. She tried to stop it with the sheer power of her thoughts, fully aware of how ugly this could get for that jerk. Tao stopped. At first, he looked completely calm, but in his eyes, a plan was already forming. A plan to punish this jerk. There was no way he could just walk away. With a temper like his, he simply couldn't let it slide. Yujin was surprised when Tao bent down, trying to pick up the cigarette butt from the ground. She couldn't even imagine why he was doing that. Tao picked it up, and by then he already knew exactly what he was going to do with it to teach that jerk a lesson. Yujin didn't understand why, out of the entire planet, that cigarette butt had to land right on Tao at the worst possible time. One look at his face told her trouble was coming. She instantly decided she needed to stop him. The stranger noticed Tao pick up the cigarette butt. Crossing his arms, he asked sarcastically what Tao planned to do with it. The man didn't say a single word. Without even looking at the jerk, he just tossed the butt straight into the guy's car. The jerk went ballistic, yelling at him, asking if he had any idea how much that car cost. Tao kept his cool and calmly replied, asking if the guy even knew what a trash can was and that cigarette butts belonged there, not on the street. The jerk shouted even louder, calling Tao a crazy freak. Watching from a distance, Yujin thought that this jerk had no idea who he was dealing with. With insults still flying out of his mouth, the man lunged at Tao with his fists, not realizing what kind of trouble he'd just gotten himself into. Yujin already had a pretty good idea how this would end, and honestly, she was more worried for the jerk, because with his arrogance, he might really get hurt. Tao had served in the military for a long time. His reflexes were flawless, and dodging a sloppy punch like that was no problem. He grabbed the guy's arm in an instant and twisted it behind his back, making the jerk cry out from the pain, struggling to break free. Holding him firmly, Tao used his other hand to grab his head and slammed him down onto the hood of the car. The jerk screamed at Tao to let him go, while he was still being nice. But Tao ignored him, replying only that he'd better never piss him off again. The pain was so intense that the man was sure his arm was about to snap. He couldn't take it anymore. Finally, he came to his senses and apologized to Tao, swearing it would never happen again, and that he understood everything now. Tao was no longer interested in teaching the guy a lesson. He let him go, and the jerk practically fell headfirst into the car. Tao was confident this kind of lesson would stick, and that the jerk would think twice before littering again. Yujin was relieved the whole scene was finally over. She was more than happy to see Tao get into her car, safe and sound. She asked if he ever thought about how weird it was to act like that in broad daylight. Though, to be honest, it was kind of satisfying to watch. Guys like that jerk sometimes needed a wake-up call. She said it, but then regretted it. It felt like she was encouraging Tao's aggressive behavior, and she didn't want him to think that kind of thing was normal. In general, she told him not to draw too much attention to himself, though she didn't actually say straight out to stay out of trouble. Yujin hoped the rest of the day would go smoothly. There was nothing else planned, so they headed back to the hotel. She'd said earlier she'd be watching him closely from now on. But right now, she needed to stop by home to grab some things so she could stay at the hotel later. She hadn't even finished speaking when Tao got out of the car, like always, not bothering to listen to her to the end. Yujin tried yelling after him, but the unruly guy didn't even turn his head. She kept shouting anyway, hoping he'd at least hear her. She warned him not to cause trouble and to stay calm, because once he lost control, stopping him would be almost impossible. She didn't want him eating dinner without her. She wanted to bring him something tasty. So she asked him to wait for her at the hotel. Yujin returned to the hotel just as the sun was going down. She dragged behind her a small suitcase with almost all her essentials packed inside. The loud rattling of the cheap suitcase annoyed her, but it was all she had. She hadn't used it in ages. She came back later than planned, thanks to her mom. Thanks. An hour earlier, her mom wouldn't let her leave, not understanding what kind of job required moving somewhere else. She was worried Yujin had gotten involved in some financial scam and was lying about it. But there was a surprise waiting for Yujin at the hotel. Something she definitely didn't expect. Her CEO was there, greeting her warmly and inviting her to sit on the couch next to her. Jin Seo immediately noticed the branded fried chicken bag in Yujin's hands and realized she must have gotten pretty close with Tao. Yujin felt like the CEO misunderstood, but she asked why the woman came to the hotel. Was it to visit her brother? Seo thought what Yujin said earlier was absurd, since she had no interest in seeing him at all. Yujin couldn't understand why the CEO thought she and Tao were suddenly so close. The woman explained she happened to be near the hotel and just wanted to see Yujin. Then, for some reason, she casually asked why Tao had returned to Korea, pretending she wasn't actually curious. There had to be a solid reason for his return, so she decided to ask Yujin. Maybe Tao had told her something. Did she really think Yujin was the kind of person Tao would spill everything to? He didn't even tell his family anything, and he'd just met her last night. The CEO realized her mistake and apologized. Yujin wasn't sure whether to speak or not, but she had a feeling Tao was looking for someone. Jin Seo was surprised. Her brother? Looking for someone? She suddenly got curious who it could be. Yujin didn't know, but then remembered she had a few questions of her own. She pulled a receipt from her pocket and asked if the company could cover the expenses. The CEO looked closely at the receipt. Her face changed immediately. She seemed lost for words. Yujin smiled to herself. What had she even expected? They'd already raised her salary sky high. Of course, there wouldn't be extra money for that. The CEO sighed, clearly upset she hadn't thought of this earlier. She pulled a credit card from her wallet and handed it to Yujin. It was the CEO's credit card. Yujin could use it to cover expenses whenever she needed. It wasn't a company card, so she could use it freely whenever necessary. But this black card was a luxury unlimited credit line in South Korea, and when the girl saw it, she froze for a moment. Jin Seo said it was fine. She could just think of it as part of the company's planned expenses, like buying snacks for the staff. Yujin asked if she could use the card to buy coffee at a nearby cafe, and the woman confirmed it. Even if one cup cost over 10,000 won, she could buy it. Did Yujin really think the CEO couldn't afford something that small for her dear Secretary Seo? Yujin was happy and grateful when the woman told her she could drink as much coffee as she wanted, 10, even 20 cups a day. Honestly, Yujin had been planning to ask for extra pay for the dangers of the job and possible medical costs. But now, she didn't have to worry about that anymore. If everything went well, the CEO would cover both the hazard pay and medical expenses, so Yujin had no reason to stress. The girl promised she'd give her all for the company, but the CEO didn't quite get what she meant. She worried that her brother might actually return only her bones. With that, Jin Seo suggested ending their conversation. She told Yujin not to tell Tao that she had been at the hotel, hoping they had a clear understanding. She also asked Yujin to remind her brother to visit home in the next few days. He'd completely forgotten. He hadn't shown up to see her or their parents since coming back to Korea. Their father was furious about it. Yujin didn't know how she'd deliver the message, but she promised she would. The girl held the black card tightly in her hands, knowing it would make her feel safe just having it with her. She understood that generosity usually came with big resources. Only the rich could afford to act this relaxed. Or maybe it was something else. It felt like she'd just received a real treasure. Something powerful. By the way, she really did remember that Jin Tao had come straight to the hotel from the airport without visiting his family. Who could be the person he was looking for? Someone more important than visiting his own parents first. His words at the mall were strange too, when he asked her to imagine being a 20-year-old girl. He'd been asking about a girl in her 20s. Maybe he was searching for someone he had once loved and been separated from. Yujin stepped into Tao's room and loudly announced that she was back. She wasn't even surprised to see Tao sitting at his desk, staring at his computer, not even acknowledging her. She asked him what he was working on, but she didn't really expect a reply anymore. She was used to talking to a wall. As she came closer, she saw that Tao was watching security camera footage from the shopping mall. The man was surprised she told him not to have dinner, but then showed up with chicken. Yujin teased him, asking if he had a problem with it. Was he looking down on chicken? It was incredibly generous of her to buy him something she could only afford on payday. She opened the box and offered Tao a taste before judging. Tao decided to try the chicken since he was starving, and to his surprise, it wasn't as bad as he imagined. Yujin tried to get him to talk, joking that everyone who'd lived abroad always missed Korean fried chicken. Tao asked if the girl had ever been abroad. She admitted she hadn't. She'd spent most of her life working to pay off her father's debts, never having enough for travel. The chicken was delicious, and they ate it quickly. They hadn't eaten all day. Yujin wanted Tao to hear her out, because not just she, but many others, thought he was way too harsh. Plus, he didn't share a single drumstick and ate them all. Tao asked if she didn't like the chicken breast she'd been enjoying so much. Yujin said no. She always saved the best for last, which is why she started with the breast. Tao, on the other hand, was the type who ate the best part first, and then everything else. Yujin was disappointed she didn't get a drumstick she loved so much. But next time, she'd keep that in mind. If it weren't for the CEO's card, she might have smacked him and happily gotten fired. But not tonight. Tonight, she was feeling too generous. When she tried asking Tao if he'd learned anything new about that girl, he scolded her. Hadn't she ever been taught not to talk with her mouth full? She wondered how someone with such perfect manners could eat all the drumsticks without even offering one to the person next to him. After finishing their meal, they went back to the computer to keep watching the mall's security footage. Looking at the monitor, Yujin asked again if Tao had found the car and what had happened to it. He stayed silent, annoyed that she was sticking her nose into his business. Her presence was starting to irritate him. The footage quality was awful, and it was hard to identify people's faces clearly. But Tao had another angle. The man's face was still blurry, but the girl's was visible. She was the one he was looking for. The footage showed a 20-year-old girl getting into a car's passenger seat. Clearly, she wasn't alone. From her calm expression and behavior, it was obvious she got into the car willingly. If you looked closer, you could tell the car was a rental. But Yujin had no idea who the girl was. Tao needed to test Yujin's analytical skills again. Maybe she could help him. He decided to tell her who the girl was. Her name was Lee Jongyong, a college student who'd gone missing a week ago. When her parents started searching, they found her car in the mall's parking lot. The last time anyone saw her was when she got out of the elevator on the first floor. It just so happened Tao returned to Korea at the same time. Since he knew her father, the man asked him to help find his daughter. They hadn't filed a police report, which was strange, but it was their right. Tao explained that they didn't want to risk making things worse. But Yujin didn't understand. If someone's missing and you don't go to the police, it looks suspicious. The footage clearly showed no crime was committed. Lee Jong-young willingly got into that car. From that moment on, the police had no reason to investigate further. Seo Yujin listened to the man carefully and came to the conclusion that this girl didn't seem to be someone close to him. Then she noticed he suddenly intended to go somewhere, even though he hadn't planned anything earlier. Curious, she asked where he was going since she was supposed to follow him everywhere. Tao replied he was going out for dinner, because half a chicken wasn't enough to fill anyone up and keep the hunger away. Yujin was stunned. He'd eaten almost the entire chicken himself since she couldn't even finish her half. Finally, Yujin made it to her hotel room. She didn't want to do anything else, just crawl into bed and rest. She lay down quickly, but couldn't fall asleep because she was so thirsty. She had simply overeaten too much today. Even though she was exhausted, her thirst was stronger, so she decided to get up and find some water. She remembered there was still a bottle of water in the fridge, but she'd have to stop by the store tomorrow to buy more. As she passed through the living room, she nearly screamed from shock. Tao was sitting silently on the couch in complete darkness. He sat there staring at a single spot, a drink in his hand. When she gasped and shouted, he didn't even flinch. He just sat there, motionless. Yujin caught herself thinking how good he looked sitting there, so calm and completely at ease. She slapped her cheeks lightly, trying to shake the thought off. She needed to get a grip. But what was he even doing there at this hour? She briefly thought about pretending she hadn't seen anything. It felt like he was asleep sitting up, yet somehow still fully alert. No wonder he looked so serious, like he was replaying everything that happened today and making plans for tomorrow. Out of nowhere, he asked why she couldn't sleep either, but he still didn't turn his head toward her. He couldn't sleep because he spent almost the entire day training. Only then would he allow himself 3 to 4 hours of rest. It was the only way he ever got any sleep. She'd heard that people who struggle with sleep are often more sensitive to their surroundings. Maybe that's why he had such a guarded, tense personality. Even several hours of morning training weren't enough to wear him out. The man finally turned his head and looked at Yujin, who stood before him in her not-so-flattering pajamas. She was amazed by how he always seemed to sense the exact moment to look at her, as if he could read her mind. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. They stared at each other but didn't know what to say. Yujin walked over to the window and was struck by how beautiful the city looked from the skyscraper's height. She'd never seen anything like it before. It was already deep into the night, but plenty of people were still awake. Korea was unusually quiet. The faint hum of passing cars and motorcycles was barely audible. Somewhere outside, cats meowed and drunk men brawled. But those sounds were just part of normal city life. Even the sound of the wind was muffled by the soundproof walls, which made the silence feel almost suffocating. When Tao called Korea quiet, Yujin was surprised. Just how intense had the place he came from been, if this silence felt foreign to him? He stared out the window, lost in thoughts about some place that clearly wasn't this quiet. It must have been incredibly hard for him to return from the army to civilian life without carrying heavy scars. Yujin could only guess what kind of sounds he was used to hearing at night. She couldn't even imagine how he truly felt. Gunfire, explosions, constant danger. Those things harden people, make them colder, and strip away compassion. Still thirsty, Yujin finally walked to the fridge to pour herself a glass of water. It was strange. She was so tired from the day, yet she couldn't fall asleep. She decided to make Tao some tea, believing it worked better than alcohol when it came to sleepless nights. Tao knew very well this wasn't ordinary insomnia, and tea wouldn't help. Yujin didn't quite understand what he meant. If he couldn't sleep, wasn't that insomnia? Either way, if he drank the tea and fell asleep, maybe he'd at least start to believe it wasn't so bad. If he didn't like tea, there were always medications. She asked if he had ever tried solving the problem with pills. He calmly asked her where she thought he had been all this time. She should have guessed. She'd been observing him all day. "What do you think would have happened if I'd been drugged up and didn't notice the enemy approaching?" he said. Yujin didn't want to hear any more. She said goodnight and headed to her bed. He frowned, frustrated that Yujin didn't want to hear the rest of his story. Was she really not curious at all? When the girl disappeared into her room, Tao stayed on the couch, glass of liquor in hand, staring out at the night city. Thinking about Yujin, he realized she was a funny, annoying little thing who somehow managed to get under his skin with her bold attitude. The next day, Yujin was amazed by how beautiful this place was. She hadn't been here in years. She asked Tao if he knew she had graduated from this very college. The place hadn't changed at all since then. She remembered everything Tao had told her on the way to the college and tried to follow his instructions. Still, she insisted he at least explain the details to her a little more. Tao didn't think it was necessary. She just needed to do exactly as he said. She began to wonder if he might have been a commanding officer in the army. He didn't think she'd remember everything at once. So he repeated what he'd said in the car. She needed to get information from Lee Jongyang's friends, just like he'd told her before, and make sure they didn't know about her disappearance. Yujin reassured him. She'd been in the drama club for 3 years in high school. In drama club, she had been a promising talent and often played key supporting roles. When Tao asked what role she played, she smiled and said, "A mandarin tree." She believed that the size of the role didn't matter, only the talent to play it well. And honestly, that little moment in her life was something she remembered most fondly. When the college girls noticed Tao, they were immediately intrigued. They wondered who he was. Could he be a senior? They thought he was handsome and wanted to get to know him better. Yujin noticed the girls' interest in Tao but couldn't understand it. They had such bright futures, but apparently no sense of taste. Tao asked if Yujin had learned anything about Lee Jongyang. She had met all of her close friends but didn't hear a single thing about a boyfriend. There wasn't even the slightest hint that she had one. But they did say she'd started acting strange about a month ago. She was always busy or doing something, constantly glued to her phone during lectures. Even the professors began scolding her for it. Tao took note of the fact that all these changes began exactly a month ago. And then Tao had to take a look at what Yujin was showing him on her phone. She checked whether Jongyang had a social media account, since almost everyone does these days. Yujin noticed that Lee Jongyang used to post videos and photos of herself playing the piano or performing on stage. But about a month ago, the tone of her posts changed drastically. She started posting pictures of what and where she ate. There were also a lot of movie ticket photos. She was going to the cinema nearly every weekend. By analyzing all of her posts, it was easy to conclude she had been going on dates. Tao scrolled through Lee Jongyang's social media page, wanting to make sure the information could actually help them. He then said they should head back to the car, but Yujin couldn't hold back her curiosity and asked where they were going next. As always, Tao was brief. He just said they were going home to analyze the information they'd gathered. But first, Tao decided to stop by his parents' house to visit them, since he hadn't seen them once since returning to Korea. When Yujin arrived at the house, she was pleasantly surprised. She noticed the parking area was even bigger than her own home. She might have been just an escort, but seriously, why did he ask her to wait in the car? He could be eating for an hour or two, and she wasn't planning on having a full dinner anyway. So why couldn't she just go with him? She figured she should at least ask when he'd be back so she wouldn't sit in the car all that time. Maybe this was her chance to use the director's black card. Yujin was surprised when she saw the CEO's car arriving at the house as well. The girl stepped out of the car and went over to Jin Seo to greet her. The woman was surprised too. She definitely didn't expect to see Secretary Seo here. She asked if her brother had actually decided to visit their parents' house. When she asked how long ago Tao had gone inside, Yujin said it had been almost 30 minutes. Seoryong was disappointed. She thought he'd picked a terrible time to visit. She didn't want Yujin just standing in the parking lot, so she invited her to come inside. The girl didn't really see why she needed to be there for a family conversation, but maybe her presence could help keep emotions in check. Was Yujin really here not to have dinner with them? Why did she suddenly decide to leave so soon? Tao finally met his sister and tried to explain he came only to say hello. The CEO was surprised. After all this time, he couldn't even stay for a family dinner? Did he not realize how much that would hurt their parents? Tao tried to explain that he simply didn't have time for family gatherings right now. He was too busy. But once he had time, he promised he would have dinner with them. Brother and sister hadn't seen each other for so long that they didn't even know what to talk about. Still, both tried on, though it didn't go very well. Tao advised his sister to pay more attention to their father's health. His blood pressure had risen even more since their last meeting. She needed to make sure he saw a doctor. She was surprised that Tao was lecturing her about it, knowing full well it was partly his fault their father's health had gotten worse. Tao said goodbye to his sister and quickly headed to the car. Yujin smiled and waved goodbye to the director as well. Jin Soryong stood in the parking lot, watching the car drive away. She realized her brother hadn't changed at all, still acting like a total jerk. Now it was time to get back to the case they hadn't been able to solve yet. Thanks to their persistence, they'd finally found something that might help locate the missing girl. They never imagined they'd get their hands on those transaction records, so they were thrilled. It was a big win to find Lee Jongyong's credit card history. It revealed where she'd been over the past week. There were transactions at the cafeteria, cafes, and some online purchases. Yujin noted her lifestyle had been pretty consistent. But a month ago, something changed. Suddenly, there were transactions at a department store, a nail salon, and an auto repair shop. Since even her friends didn't know she had a boyfriend, it was likely he didn't go to the same college. If she met him at one of those three places, the department store or the auto shop seemed far more likely than the nail salon. Tao decided they should check the auto shop first. Yujin was to review the transactions from the 3 days following her visit there. Yujin was puzzled. Why 3 days? What could have happened in that time? It turned out she'd gone back to the same auto shop. But this time, she'd spent very little. Her social media posts started to shift around that same time, which was odd since she'd never had these kinds of expenses before. There were plenty of restaurant and cafe photos, but no matching transactions. A guy might pay once or twice, but covering every single check? That stood out. So the logical conclusion was that this guy was putting in effort, trying to impress her. Exactly. Lee Jongyong's boyfriend clearly wanted to look good in her eyes. If he could afford to pay for her, that likely meant he was an office worker, but didn't have his own car. If he did have a car, she wouldn't have needed to drive to the mall herself. On top of that, he'd rented a car. He probably should have just told her he'd be driving too. Tao fully agreed with Yujin's conclusions, and she was genuinely proud to prove how smart and useful she could be to him. Tao decided to head out again. Yujin guessed he was hungry and wanted dinner. He invited her to come along, joking that he'd let her magical fingers push the elevator buttons. Evening had fallen once again, and the city lights shone even brighter than the night before. Tao walked into the living room to sit quietly and look at the night city through the window. But then he noticed something moving on the couch. He immediately realized that Yujin must have made herself comfortable on the couch for the night, but still asked why she decided to sleep here of all places. Yujin hadn't expected him to return so soon, so she chose the couch because it felt the most comfortable to her. Dressed in a bathrobe, Tao looked completely different, softer and less strict than he usually did in his regular clothes. He asked why she gave up her perfectly cozy bed to sleep in the living room. Yujin didn't know what to say at first, but then explained that it was too quiet in her room and she couldn't fall asleep. Could it really be that she found an alternative to her magical bed and chose this couch and the noise from the street? Yujin got up from the couch and noticed he was drinking alcohol again. She wanted to remind him that she'd already told him to drink tea instead. When she was a child, her parents used to tell her that chamomile tea helped with insomnia, and they always drank it together. After making Tao a big cup of tea, Yujin lay back down on the couch, wished for a quiet night, turned to the other side, and tried to fall asleep. She must have been exhausted and comforted by not being alone. She fell asleep fast. Tao sat on the opposite couch, watching how sweetly Yujin slept, and even felt a little jealous of how easily she could do it. He spent almost the entire night in the living room, waiting until the sun started to rise. But he didn't feel sleepy at all. Yujin woke up in the morning, not expecting to see Tao nearby. She stretched sweetly. She'd slept peacefully and well. As she stretched, she didn't even notice Tao walking toward her from another room. It felt like he hadn't slept at all. He asked how she slept and how she was feeling. Now she could compare. Which was better, her bed or the living room couch? But his face didn't look like someone who actually cared about how she slept. To look the way Tao did now, he definitely needed more than just a couple hours of sleep. But for the first time in a while, he'd actually slept deeply and felt rested. Yujin curiously asked where exactly he'd slept. Where else could he have slept but his own room? Did she really think he'd sneak around in the middle of the night just to find another place to sleep? Yujin thought he was lying. He'd once said he couldn't sleep well because it was too quiet and he had to sleep on the couch. She couldn't believe he actually slept in his comfy bed. Apparently, she was the only one with sensitive sleep. Tao noticed just how soundly she slept. She didn't even wake up when he went to and returned from training. But Yujin's neck and shoulders were sore from sleeping on the couch. Tao asked if she wanted to join him for breakfast or had changed her mind. Yujin was starving, so of course she agreed. Besides, her job was to keep an eye on him. Skipping wasn't an option. According to their plan, today they were going to visit the auto shop that Lee Jong-young had supposedly gone to. At the shop, a mechanic greeted them and asked how he could help. Yujin pointed to her car and said she wanted to get the oil changed. The mechanic was surprised. He could tell right away she had a luxury car. She clarified that the car was indeed nice, but, unfortunately, it belonged to the company she worked for. He smiled, said it would only take a minute, and quickly started changing the oil. The girl mentioned that she'd seen a young guy working there before, but he didn't seem to be around today. Without stopping his work, the mechanic asked if she meant Mr. Young. Yujin smiled. Yes, that must have been his name. He'd promised to give her perfect service next time, but he wasn't there today. The mechanic said the guy hadn't shown up for about 10 days. He hadn't had time to find a replacement yet and was pretty annoyed about the sudden resignation. Yujin remarked that it must be tough working alone. The mechanic admitted he'd asked the guy to stay longer, but Young just hung up coldly. He had been a good worker and great with customers too. Yujin did her best to distract the mechanic so Tao could look around the shop more carefully. But she didn't understand why he was taking so long. If they got caught, they wouldn't be able to get more information. The mechanic noticed it looked like Yujin had changed the oil not too long ago. She pretended not to know anything about it. She claimed that couldn't be true since the car had been making noises every time she stopped. She asked him to check it more thoroughly. Maybe the problem wasn't the oil after all, the mechanic thought, deciding to take a closer look. Plus, she looked like someone who could pay well. Tao was rummaging in one place for quite a while. Yujin figured he must have found something interesting. She didn't get how he could just search through someone else's workspace without permission and act like it was perfectly normal. If it weren't for her distraction skills, they'd definitely have been caught. But Tao didn't respond or thank her. The girl realized he was ignoring her again, but didn't make a big deal out of it. Tao walked ahead and finally stopped, saying this was the place they needed. According to the service center's records, their guy, Jung In-ho, lived in this building. But they couldn't just barge into his home like that. They needed a believable reason to visit. Yujin thought maybe Lee Jong-young had willingly gotten into his car. Maybe they'd run away for love. Who was she to interfere in someone's relationship? Tao didn't care about her principles or whether there was love involved. He was just doing the job he was hired to do. So, he told her to forget everything she'd just said and focus on the mission. Seo Yujin, the promising drama club talent, Tao said with heavy irony. Something in his voice made her nervous. He told Yujin that today she'd play a leading role. She hadn't been ready for that, but she had no choice. She asked what exactly she needed to do. She'd have to use her acting skills and make it convincing. There wouldn't be a second chance. His words genuinely scared her. She understood that one wrong move could cost them a lot. Plan A was to break down the front door, and Plan B was to use a rope, climb down from the roof, and enter through the balcony. Plan C was to use her acting skills to make him open the door himself. Yujin couldn't believe that in such a short time, this crazy guy had come up with 3 completely absurd plans. But he was genuinely waiting for her decision. The final call was hers. He didn't care what she chose. His goal was simply to get into Young's apartment. Yujin leaned more toward Plan C, though she could avoid direct participation. Plan B sounded tempting too, but it was too risky and harsh. She knew he would be less tense in front of a woman. But first, she had to admit to him that she had never really been the promising talent of the drama club. But he ignored her again and headed straight for the apartment they needed. At the door, Teo pulled a pair of dark gloves from his pocket and put them on. Yujin didn't understand why he needed gloves. They were counting on him opening the door voluntarily, relying only on her talent. Teo explained that the situation could get complicated if his fingerprints were found, which could bring trouble with the police. But why didn't he think about her? She could leave fingerprints too, and then the trouble could fall on her. He reassured her that wearing gloves would actually look suspicious for her, so it was better he wore them. Gathering her courage, Yujin finally knocked on the door. She didn't even notice her hand trembling slightly. She pulled her blouse sleeve over her hand. Better safe than sorry, since her fingerprints could be left on the door. The apartment was empty, no one was there, and the lights were off. They hesitated, but had to step inside to make sure the place was really empty. Yujin didn't hear anyone and was convinced the apartment was empty, so technically they didn't need to go in. But Teo was sure he had seen a shadow on the balcony. He wanted Yujin to show off her outstanding skills she often bragged about. She was genuinely scared. She had no skills in deception or breaking into apartments, and her acting talent wouldn't help now. She tried knocking again, saying she was the downstairs neighbor and water was dripping from the ceiling. Maybe a pipe had burst. Could the apartment really be empty? If someone was deliberately ignoring her, she might have to call the police. After her words, they heard footsteps behind the door and waited for someone to answer. Yujin was genuinely terrified. She had no idea what she would do when the door opened. They heard a faint click, and the door creaked open. A young man peeked out, asking what they needed since nothing had happened in his apartment. The fact that the guy had ignored their knocks meant he either had something to hide or was really scared of something. When he peeked through the crack, Yujin immediately recognized him. It really was the guy from the resume they'd seen earlier. The girl had a great photographic memory, remembering everything down to the smallest detail. Apartment 301 in the Wujiang district. Everything matched. From the photos, this guy looked identical to the one peeking from his apartment. Young Inho asked again why they needed anything and why they had been knocking so persistently. Nothing had happened in his apartment. Yujin continued playing the role of the neighbor, complaining that water was dripping from her ceiling and it looked really bad. She asked if he planned to do anything about it. The guy insisted it was impossible. It seemed like he didn't believe her at all, constantly denying any wrongdoing. She had to act very angry. She couldn't understand what he meant by impossible. She insisted there was a flood in her apartment and wondered if he was implying she was lying. Of course, he didn't want to accuse her, but he had no intention of letting her into his apartment either. He knew a lonely elderly couple lived below him, so he asked again, why was she deceiving him? Hearing this from Young, Yujin didn't know what to say next, so she had to improvise. She couldn't mess this up. She needed to strengthen her performance and fully commit to her role. She quickly came up with the idea that she was the couple's granddaughter. She had just come to stay a few days while looking for a job, but for now, that detail didn't matter. Why didn't he just come downstairs himself and see for himself if he didn't trust her words? That way, no one could later claim they had nothing to do with it. Young said he'd fix everything and settle any inconvenience later, but right now he was way too busy to help. When Young Inho tried to slam the door, the girl couldn't let him. The first thought that came to her mind was to jam her foot in the doorway. She'd seen this trick before. She screamed immediately because it hurt, realizing she might have overdone it and didn't know what to do next. When the guy said he'd go downstairs with her, he was really just trying to close the door to engage the crosslock. Yujin trusted him, expecting him to leave his apartment, but she never imagined he just wanted to slam the door in her face. Tao knew the trick well and quickly grabbed the door with his hand, stopping the guy from locking it. Young Inho realized the girl at his door wasn't alone and tried to push the stranger away with force. But he failed. Tao was way stronger. He opened the door fast and moved to enter the apartment. The guy shouted, "What the hell's going on? Who the hell are you to barge into my apartment like this?" Tao punched him in the chest but kept a firm grip on his sweater to stop him from falling. Then, after hitting him again, Young flew across the room and crashed to the floor at the far end. Tao told Yujin to lock the front door and the balcony window. She understood immediately and hurried to do it. First, she locked the front door with the heavy, sturdy lock. Then she ran to the balcony to secure the window, knowing the guy could try to escape any second. Young barely got back on his feet, still not understanding who they were or what they wanted from him. Tao didn't bother with small talk. He had one question, the reason he was even in this apartment. Where's Lee Jong-young? Young In-ho pretended not to understand why he was being asked about this girl. He couldn't possibly know where she was. He, staying alert, grabbed a kitchen knife and threatened Tao, saying, "Do you really think you'll leave this apartment alive after what you've done with your accomplice?" Tao wasn't surprised. He was ready for this. All he cared about was keeping Yujin out of the fight. Knife threats didn't faze him. He still needed an answer and wasn't going anywhere without it. Yujin knew that if Young claimed he didn't know where Lee Jong-young was, it meant he must be familiar with her. Otherwise, the guy would have asked who this girl was and why Tao was asking about her. Young In-ho's words had exposed him, confirming Tao's suspicion that he was involved in her disappearance. As Tao stepped closer, the guy waved the knife, warning he'd cut him if he came another step. But Tao wasn't intimidated. Tao knew exactly what to do. He stripped off his jacket and held it in front of him like a shield. Young In-ho continued threatening, insisting he wasn't joking. Tao locked eyes with him, showing he was stronger and fearless despite the threats. Young got nervous, realizing this guy wasn't easily intimidated. Without hesitation, he lunged at Tao, screaming and brandishing the knife. Dodging his clumsy knife swings wasn't hard. He clearly wasn't a pro. Tao quickly wrapped Young's arms in his jacket, stopping him from swinging the knife further. Before he knew it, the guy's arms were trapped, and he couldn't do anything. Tao elbowed him in the nose, disorienting him completely. Young slumped to the floor, blood gushing from his nose. He couldn't fight anymore. Tao pinned him down, twisted his arm, and asked the same question one last time, demanding an answer. "Where is Lee Jong-young?" Young In-ho dodged the question again, asking why it concerned him. Tao pressed his knee into Young's back, hearing bones crack. The guy screamed in pain but still refused to answer. Just then, Yujin rushed in, shouting for Tao to stop immediately. Was he trying to kill him? Young hadn't come out despite all the noise, meaning Lee Jong-young might not even be there. Continuing this would make headlines. Yujin didn't think Tao should go that far. It wouldn't help him. Tao didn't plan to stop. He stepped on the guy's hand with his boot, pressing for the answer about the girl. Yujin couldn't watch anymore. She silently begged Buddha to show mercy and save them. She turned away and heard a strange sound through the closed door. Peeking through the glass, she couldn't believe her eyes. She'd never seen anything like it. She called Tao over to look. There was no need for questions anymore. The answer was clear. Tao didn't understand what the girl saw that required his attention. Could it be Lee Jong-young hiding in another room? Yujin was furious, calling Young In-ho a monster and ready to deal with him herself. On the floor lay a girl, barely moving. Her hands and feet were tightly bound, and her mouth sealed with tape. For some reason, Tao didn't rush, even though Yujin was calling him frantically. Judging by her expression, it was clear she was in shock from what she'd just seen. To make sure the guy didn't pose a threat, Tao hit him hard on the head, knocking him unconscious. With him out of the way, he could finally go after Yujin and see with his own eyes what was happening in the other room. The girl stood in front of the door, unable to bring herself to open it. She was certain she'd see something she could never unsee. When she finally opened it, she barely noticed the girl lying on the floor of the empty room. She froze, unable to believe this was happening in real life. She had only ever seen something like this in movies. They called the girl's name to check if she was alive. She just croaked back, unable to respond properly because her mouth was taped shut. The best news at that moment, she was alive, even though she was exhausted and covered in bruises. Yujin was stunned. Could this guy who seemed so sweet at first glance really be a monster with maniacal tendencies? They needed to untie her hands and feet, but the bindings were tight, so they'd need a knife to speed things up. Yujin couldn't bear to watch. Tears filled her eyes, and she could barely see what was in front of her. Finally, they managed to free her hands, but under the tape, they saw huge bruises covering her arms and legs. Tao quickly lifted Lee Jong-young into his arms. They needed to get her out of that apartment fast and to a medical facility for treatment. As they were leaving Young's apartment, Yujin asked what would happen to that idiot. They couldn't just leave him alone in the apartment. Tao said he didn't necessarily need to do anything to him, but he was sure from this moment on, young Inho's life would become unbearable. Young came too, screaming after them that he had wanted to finish her off. But she kept crying about her family strangling her with pressure and complaining about her old father. So he had let her into his home and even cared for her for a while. The next moment, Yujin spun around and kicked the bastard with all her might. She crossed her arms over her chest to resist the urge to beat him up and shouted, "How can someone like him talk about caring?" In her opinion, he deserved a good beating. Tao froze with the girl in his arms. He hadn't expected this fragile and seemingly sweet girl to have so much strength and anger inside her. He even felt respect for her.
All right, let's be real. We've all seen red flags before, but Jin Tao is a whole crimson forest. He looks like a literal dream, but that ruthless beast personality? Yujin really signed up for the most dangerous job in the world. I honestly don't know if I should be worried for her or jealous of her. Probably both. So, what do you think? Is Jin Tao a total must-protect crush or a run-for-your-life psycho? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Part 2 is coming very soon, and trust me, the taming process gets absolutely wild.